good afternoon, and good evening for those joining us from different parts of the world. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this panel discussion on understanding and confronting Latin American gangs. My name is Lucia Tiscornia. I'm Assistant Professor of International Studies at CIDE in Mexico City and an academic member of Evidence in Governance and Politics. This event is being organized by Evidence in Governance and Politics, or EGAP. EGAP is a research, evaluation, and learning network made up of researchers, practitioners, and policymakers. And it's created to promote rigorous knowledge accumulation, innovation, and evidence-based policy in various governance and accountability domains. As part of EGAP's work, it recently established a set of priority themes to serve as a focal point for bringing together researchers and practitioners whose work relates to those themes in order to discuss issues and questions at the forefront of the field and contribute to a concrete research agenda. Today's panel discussion is the first seminar event for the Crime Reduction and Police Accountability Priority Theme. You can read more about this theme at the website links that Max is posting in the chat. As part of this priority theme, EGAP is also excited to announce the launch today of a new policing in the Global South webpage, which offers a variety of research papers, evidence summaries, and other resources for those interested in this topic. For the panel today, we are very excited to bring together a group of experts, each of whom has studied the phenomenon of gangs and criminal organizations in different contexts around Latin America. So without further ado, I would like to present the members of the panel. Joana Monteiro is Associate Research Scholar at the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University, a Professor of Public Policy at the Brazilian School of Public and Business Administration at Getúlio Vargas Foundation, and Director of the Center for Applied Research for Public Security at Getúlio Vargas Foundation. Santiago Tobón is a Professor of Economics and the Director of the Center for Research in Economics and Finance, CF, at Universidad EAFIT in Medellín, Colombia. He is also a research and innovations for poverty actions and academic, he's also a researcher, at Innovations for Poverty Action, an academic member of Evidence in Governance and Politics, and an invited researcher of JPAL's Crime and Violence Initiative, and an affiliate of Households in Conflict Network. Andrés Tobón is a Colombian professional and academic with experience in citizen security, peace building, and collective construction of social capital. He is currently a member of the National Advisory Board for the Transformation of Colombia's National Police, Professor of EAFIT School of Science and Humanities, and consultant in citizen security affairs. Maria Micaela Schiacci was scheduled to participate, but a personal matter came up that prevented her from being with us today. So just a bit of housekeeping. As you have noticed, we did not set up today's session as a webinar, but rather as a roundtable meeting. Because of that, you are able to turn on your microphone and your camera. You're free to keep your cameras off or on during the event. However, we do ask that you mute your microphones during the discussion. We also have EGAP staff on the call that will mute microphones that are turned on inadvertently. If you have a question or a comment, we encourage you to type it into the chat message box. In time permitting, we will review them at different points during the discussion. Lastly, I want to mention that we are recording this event and will make it publicly available on EGAP's website and release it as a podcast episode of EGAP's Governance Loop podcast. So with that, I would like to begin by asking our panelists, what do we already know and what do we still need to learn about when it comes to the study of gangs and criminal organizations? Santiago, why don't you get us started?
Thank you, Lucia. Hi, everyone. And I'm very happy to see many familiar faces, not only of friends, but also co-authors that I hadn't seen for a while before. Yeah, so I think like the short answer is that we know little from my perspective. We know, for instance, that gangs engage in violence. We know that they explain a lot of the violence in many of the cities in Latin America. We also know that gangs are prevalent throughout a large part of the region, mainly in Brazil, Colombia, Venezuela, and Central America and Mexico, but also in other places and are actually growing there as well. We know also that gangs not only engage in drug markets, but also in other illegal and legal markets. For instance, in Brazil or Colombia, they might engage in monopolizing legal goods markets, such as gas canisters and so on. They also extort and do some other businesses that we know. And we also know that gangs in Latin America exert authority in a way that actually mimics a state's function, so that they provide security, they provide dispute resolution, and they act as if they were states in some like policy domains, so to speak. But we still need to learn a lot about gangs. I believe, don't have enough information on their finances. We don't have enough information on their organization. We don't have enough information in the type of operations they engage in, their business lines, their labor markets, how they recruit. And I guess we are in a point where there's a risk that we generalize too much the very few information that we have. And we had kind of a precedent for that. We have this very famous Levitt and Venkatesh paper of this Chicago gang, where we actually learn a lot, and I'm not going to say no, but we cannot generalize out of a defunct gang how to interpret a very highly organized group in Rio de Janeiro. We also need to learn more, I would say, and I will stop with this because I want also everyone to have time. I tend to monopolize the microphone. I believe we don't know what to do with gangs, right? From the policy perspective. We have some ideas, but many ideas that governments have tried actually failed, and we barely know when they fail. So I guess we need to learn a lot more about gangs. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Santiago. I want to hear, before moving on to the last point that you mentioned, I would like to hear from Joana and Andrés as well.
Thank you, Lucia. It's a pleasure to be here in the middle of so many scholars and people that really study this topic. So I'm gonna I agree with many things that Santiago just said. I think that most of our knowledge about violence comes from literature on conflict and literature in the United States. And I think the first thing that we need to emphasize, it seems to me that what happened in Latin America, specifically around organized criminal groups, is quite different from what we see from that regions. And I think in the last years, we have evolved a lot in the literature, mainly due to studies of Mexico and Colombia. But many of these studies focus a lot on conflict and on criminal wars and trying to understand what drives violence. And I think we still need to understand a lot about the business model of these groups, not the business models, but the business activities, like the enterprise that analyze these groups through the firm lens. And I think this is quite important to Latin America, because what we have learned to United States, for instance, related to gangs, is that these gangs are not that organized and not that business oriented, and most of the conflicts are due to vendettas many of the time. I don't think this is what happened in Latin America. What we have there is that criminal groups that control important share of the territory, and they go then and they control the territory, like they try to exert the monopoly of coercion or force in order to establish local monopolies. And they're gonna do, and they're gonna explore everything they can for this territory. But what we see in practice, what we see, for instance, in Brazil, in particular in Rio, is that you see different territories that they explore different markets, like sometimes illegal goods, sometimes legal goods. And why is that? How do they operate? Which market's more important than the other? Which ones do they have more profits than others? So I think we really do not know that. And I want to emphasize something that Santiago said, that most of our knowledge comes from ethnographic studies, sociological studies that focus on one slum, one favela, and we have a lot of information from that. But we really don't have generalizable information, systematic information to know how they have been growing, what are the steps as these groups evolve, what are the crucial revenues they have. And in addition, I think this is something that we really need to devote resources. And in addition to that, I think we need to understand that we have, talking about generalizability, I think we need to stop to understand different criminal markets. For instance, back in Rio, now everybody talks about militia. So militia is a name that is used now for any type of crime that involves a policeman. And there are several types of crimes that may be linked to that. You have extortion that takes place in any country in the world. You have like this typical exploration of economic activities due to the control of the territory. There are the service of sicarios, for instance. I don't know how to say that in English, that when you pay people to kill the others, right? And you have like, in the market for transportation is different from the market for drugs, that is different from the market for water and so on. And I think we need to start to teasing out these markets and understand which one drives the most margin. And there is gambling, there is interest loans. So there are a lot of stuff, and we really do not. And I think when we look everything at the same thing, we are mixing stuff. And another thing that I think in the last years I realized in Rio, that why it is important to do that is that we like to choose our enemies in terms of society. So what we have done in the last 20, 30 years in Latin America is to select that as the drug traffic organizations, our key enemy, and like all the efforts of the states needs to be driven to these groups. And I think this is quite instrumental for many politicians to in order to do that, because it allows them to do other stuff. And the last point I want to comment that I think really differentiates Latin America from the rest of the world is we need to bear in mind as the first point that these groups only exist because they are entrenched with politics and with the government. They're not a parallel state, they are part of the states. Not part of the states, they are different relationships, but to understand, how to fight about these groups is to understand how the police work, how law enforcement works, how politics takes place. And I think this needs to be on the core of the agenda of understanding criminal groups in Latin America.
Thank you, Joana. Andrés.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here talking with you guys. Well, first thing I think I really need to say is that criminal structures function as private companies. Their main objective always unnecessarily is associated with money. Although it's true that the power plays a very important role, it cannot be separated from the preponderance of money. Power is power because of it's based on money and what money can achieve in all that function organ rules. Let's think for a second about the operation of private companies. Those who knows a little bit, just a little bit about business, knows very well that it's deeply problematic what they needs to work on that field. Private companies all the time have problems with their clients, with their suppliers, with the state, and of course, with their competitors. In general, these types of problems are solved without looking for the intervention of big institutions, without looking for the intervention of the state, but through internal mechanisms for which there are channels, protocols, and sort of bureaucracy that they have in order to solve that kind of problems that they have in the interior of the companies. Only exceptionally, when that kind of mechanisms fail, companies are forced to look out for the intervention of the state. Only exceptionally. Laws, law enforcement officers, courts, tribunals, for example, fulfill this exceptional function of intervention when it's necessary. The same thing happens, exactly the same thing happens in criminal structures. If we think of criminal structures as private companies without moralizing their products and their businesses, we are forced to accept that in effective terms, they have the same problems as any other kind of private company. In fact, at first, all the discussions and problems that they may have with their clients, with their suppliers, with their competitors, tend to be resolved through mechanisms for which they have also created rules and even certain levels of bureaucracy. They have people to work on that kind of problems without violence. That's the first situation that they have. They don't want to use violence at the first time. They don't use violence as a first step. The big difference appears, the big difference between legal big companies and criminal structures appears in the exception. Formally, the criminal structures cannot turn to the state, cannot ask for the help of the state. The problems that cannot be solved by means of the mechanisms already mentioned are solved by the exceptional tools that criminals have at their disposal, the violence. Violence is the exceptional tools of criminals. And that is the things that we actually see all the times. The ways in which criminals solve the problem that they cannot solve in the internal affairs of their business. We only see the dramatic consequences of the solving of the problems that they cannot be solved in the internal areas. Although this reading of criminal structures that understand them as private companies is not new, that is not a new point of view, is still a field without sufficient investigative development. We may know about this reality thanks to us, maybe journalistic investigation, sociological investigation, and very important narrative works, but we don't know a lot, as just Santiago and Joana said, how their finance works or how the apparatus actually works. Maybe if we work a little bit on it, maybe if we approach our investigation or our intentions to disaggregate the apparatus, to disaggregate how actually that kind of private companies that we call structures or criminal structure works, maybe at time point, we will be able to see the critical points in order to maybe combat it at the end. I think that there is a big opportunity for us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andres. And I'm about to call on you again in a moment. I would like to move on to our next question, which the three of you have kind of touched on as you were talking. So thinking about policy making, what are some of the challenges policymakers face today in dealing with criminal organizations? Andres, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the main problem that the states have in combating criminal structures now is coordination. Coordination is the big issue of all the states in order to combat criminal structures of gangs. Although this sounds like a little bit as a cliche, and it's probably because we have been hearing that kind of stuff, through decades, it has not ceased to be a reality. It's still the reality that coordination is the big issue that we have in order to, works against criminal structures, works against criminal gangs, and of course, in order to create policies that are able and are efficient to deploy the power of the criminal structures. Criminal structures are private companies, as I said before, that manage illegal products, which have an impact on social condition. Maybe that kind of impacts, negative impacts, are partly a result of their illegality. And as if that were not enough, these are companies that use violence and corrupt the state in order to function. It is an issue that requires an holistic understanding from the state and the civil society. We must answer questions that range from the understanding of what is and what is not illegal. That's a thing that Santiago knows very, very well when he works and when he speaks about marijuana and other kind of drugs that are illegal in certain parts of the world, like in Colombia right now. And maybe always to answer what are the tools that we have at our disposal to combat criminal structures and to seek the protection of the society and the society's social fabric, because it's an holistic point of view. We need to know what is illegal and what is not illegal. We need to change the laws that determine that. We need to understand what kind of tools we actually have to combat criminal structures. And we also need to protect the society when we combat criminal structures. We cannot combat criminal structures damaging the society. That is something that happens very, very often in Latin America, and it is still happening in Colombia, for example. Criminal structures put in check the essence of the social contract. For this reason, agreeing with all the actors, that is, coordinating them, continues to be, for me, from my point of view, the main challenge that we have in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. I'm going to now move on to Joana and Santiago, and after you guys have answered, there is a question in the chat that I think is really relevant to the discussion, so we can take it up after your interventions, if that's okay.
Okay, so I think the first key challenge is the size of this group. So they are huge criminal enterprises nowadays that they have like lots of resources. So and they are, depending on the city you go, they are pretty much in a lot of parts of the territory. And they drive like different problems. Sometimes it's violence, sometimes it's different revenue, sometimes it's extortion. So I think the crucial thing first is that we need to decide, like, to have a strategy and a clear goal, what to do, what's the priority, what we should, the focus of the policy strategy. In that sense, I think the idea of the focus deterrence strategy that have been developed in the United States is pretty important in that sense, that they say the first thing is to establish a goal, a common goal across all law enforcement and criminal law enforcement institutions. But then, in order to do that in Latin America, we have an additional challenge, which is we need to recognize that the very few people that are supposed to combat this group sometimes are working with them. So, and then this comes the problem of coordination that Andrés comes. So one of the key parts of the focus deterrence strategy that you need to coordinate the criminal enforcement effort. And how to do that when you have, so part of the people who are supposed to combat, you don't know actually what they are doing. And you don't know like which sides they are playing. And in addition to that, I think it's also important to have in mind, in the context of Latin America, the government is always doing something. It's not that they are not doing any activity. They have actually, they have a lot of militarized approach in order to fight these groups. And they must do that to signal they are doing something. And the key challenge is to say whether they are doing something, to identify whether they are doing something that it's good and in the direction that we would expect, or whether they are doing something in order to protect a different group, a criminal group. So in that sense, I think this poses a lot of challenge in thinking how to move on this law enforcement strategies. And in that sense, I think we need a lot of transparency on what the police, what law enforcement are doing, in the sense, what are their goals, what they are supposed to do. And we can't have a lot of discretion in the like say on the streets, for instance. We need to have control where the police is going. What is the prioritization about the priority about prosecutors to do? So I think we need to have like a clear strategy about what to do, with having in mind that all the connections that we have with the government. But it's extremely difficult to do it.
Right. Yeah. So what are the challenges? And I'll also try to address a part of Don's question here. Like, I think I agree with what Joana and Andres said. I think, for instance, coordination is a clear problem. It might sound as a cliche, but it's not. And once you're in a position, as Andres was, Secretary of Security in a city that has a very complex citizen security problems, then you actually face that very clearly. But I'd like to just make a quick reference to something that one of my co-authors, Chris Blattman, used to mention a lot, which is that he kind of says that being like a Secretary of Security or maybe the commander or the chief of the Metropolitan Police Department in a city or the mayor, right? It's very much like being in charge of regulating a sector without having the information. And this is why this is related to what Don was mentioning. So think, for instance, of someone that's in charge of regulating financial markets, but that person doesn't have information on which are the companies, which are the prices that they're selling, which are the products that they're trading, what's the volume of their operations, where the money goes afterwards. And you still have to regulate that market. So I think that pretty much people in charge of citizen security is regulating a market that exists without enough information. So what would I do with data, as Don is saying? I guess the first thing to do with data is to describe what's going on, right?
Santiago, sorry, if you
yes.
don't mind actually reading the question, since this is
recorded
and it's going to be a podcast so that we have it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question Don has is, I understand the recurrent point about the lack of systematic data about gangs, but imagine you could ask for and receive any data you wanted from the gangs. What data would you want, and what would you do with that data then? So this is why I described this problem of regulating a market where you don't have the information. So if you're the financial supervisor or regulator, you ask all these companies to report on their operations and all this, the things they do, so that you can regulate how they relate to each other, how they are behaving, and so on. So you want to regulate the criminal sector, but you don't have information on how it works. So I guess the first point is to understand better what's going on, right? And if I were in the government, then use that data, those descriptions to, this will maybe sound as a cliche as well, develop and then evaluate interventions. But the thing is that I believe we think we know more than what we know. And think about, for instance, recruitment into gangs, right? So there's this very complex labor market of gangs, right? In Medellin, for instance, we roughly estimate that there are 10,000, mostly men, mostly young people in street gangs, right? So this is a lot of people. And it's not that, and we roughly estimate that there are 350 street gangs in Medellin that are called combos. This is not a normal labor market. It's not that they post as in in the academic labor market, a position, and then kids from throughout the city would apply, right? This is something that you need to develop a lot of trust. So most likely recruits are from the same neighborhood. Also, it's something that's not discrete, but happens within a period of 3, 4, 5 years. And in many cases, it happens actually without people being aware of what's going on. So you're a 12-year-old, you start doing some small work for the gang. And once you're 16, you're in the gang and you're, gaining more money, and your chances of moving away of the gang are lower. And we don't know the trajectories of these kids, for instance. So I would ask something about this kind of data, how can we describe the trajectories of people within gangs, so that we can think more systematically about what Andres was saying before, which are the points where the state can do something to actually interrupt this process, right? And in particular with gang recruitment is one problem where we think we have solutions. Yeah, maybe a good educational system, maybe providing assistance to households that are struggling, so that you can help parents or replace parents to some degree, so that you can steer the guy in a good way. But those are very costly interventions, and we have a lot of recruits throughout the region. So you really need to think about what's cost effective, and for that you need a lot of data. But beyond all this, I think, and this is also goes to the challenge of the policymakers in this respect, is that, and I think this is kind of a rather less optimistic view, is that even if we have all this information, right, I think in the end, the incentive is there for gangs to be created, to grow and become stronger, because someone needs to regulate the markets that they're regulating, right? So pretty much every city in the world has a local cocaine market that works, right? People can access and buy cocaine in Chicago, in Medellin, in Rio de Janeiro, and everywhere, right? And cocaine is illegal everywhere. So someone needs to set up the market, and someone needs to set up a system so that you can regulate contracts between parties in this market. So I believe that states that manage to actually decrease violence have had an approach. I'm thinking, for instance, about New York. Probably in New York, there's more cocaine use now than there was 20 years ago, but most likely, I don't have the data, there's less violence now. And this is probably because there's some like gray area in the regulation and like a sort of tolerance by the police to allow for some markets to work. Maybe do not engage too much with that and let it go, right? And this maybe sort of works in more developed nations, but this certainly doesn't really work in where states are weaker and where these gangs can then, as Joana was saying, start to control what the government does or does not, and kind of vertically integrate with the local state because there's a lot of money at stake. So even in cities in Latin America, I'm thinking about Montevideo or Santiago de Chile, that are cities in places that are relatively well developed. Most likely in 20 years, gangs, they're going to be growing and growing more, right? So I think that there are like two levels of the discussion on policymaking. Like one is, what can we do to stop gang recruitment, like as I was saying? But the other question is, which are really the incentives for these gangs to be created and grow stronger and develop this coercive capacity? And this question is really linked to drug markets and most likely to other like similar illegal markets where the state definitely needs to step in and start regulating rather than delegating that regulation to illegal groups.
Thank you, Santiago. I would like to pick up on this last point that you were making. You know, thus far, we've identified some of the gaps in academic knowledge. We've also talked about some of the challenges that policymakers face, but I'm sure that many people are wondering, well, what do we do next, right? So what are some of the key policy decisions that need to be made in order to combat this phenomenon? I would like to call on Joana first, then Santiago, and then Andrés.
I think you're muted, Joana.
Hello. I will talk about the perspective of Brazil. Okay, so which is like this year we're gonna have presidential governorial elections. So and this is gonna be a quite important topic. I think the first crucial thing maybe is the most important one. Like the politician who is elected must wanted to really fight this cause. A lot of, I would say that 99%, like they pretend they want to fight. They do not really want to, they want to just signal they are doing something, but they are not really committed in order to at least restrain the power of these groups. And this is quite challenging because many politicians got in power with the support of some groups. So this is quite challenging in the sense that how you're going to get that politician in order to fight something. So I don't have the answer for that question, but I think, so what we can do as civil society is, as a researcher, is that to have a clear, and we have been working on that here, like to have a clear set of goals and agendas that people need to commit in order to at least first to understand who is a little bit more committed than others in order to fight and to make some decisions. The second thing that is quite important in Brazil, and we went back a lot over the last 5 years, is that we need to control, we need a very qualified police, and a police that have some control, that a police that cannot go on the streets and do whatever they want. We need to know where they are, what they are doing, why they are in a specific place, who sent them there, like what are the planning to send them there. So, and we need. So when I say control, I'm not talking only about like a strong internal affairs body. I'm talking about like using data, using information systems in order to keep track what the policing is doing on the streets. In countries such as Colombia, this is quite established. In some states in Brazil, this is also established, but in others, we don't have any control about what the police is doing. In addition to that, we need to put transparency in the judicial system, particular in prosecutors and judges, what they're doing, what their decisions, what they are, whether they are. So we simply don't know what they're doing, and a lot of them are not working at all. So we really need to improve effectiveness of the crime and about this part of the judicial system. And on top of that, I think we need to have priority on homicide investigation and on legal gun trade investigation. This is something that sometimes some people say that a lot of people argue that we need to prioritize homicide investigation due to two main reasons. One is that this is a flag of organized criminal groups. So homicides are object of dispute resolution. So if we keep track on these deaths, we're gonna know a lot about what is going on in terms of the criminal markets. And and also increase the incentives for them to pick better, which exact we need to, when we put a lens on that, we increase the cost about committing homicides on that. And many times when I discuss that with prosecutors or politicians or policemen, they argue that, okay, but homicide investigation, we need a lot of technology, we need a lot of investment and so on. And this is true. But if we simply monitor the data and keep track about what is going on, which places are going up and down, and what do you believe that is going on, what we have information from the field telling that is going on, we already put a lens on the system, and a lot of people, we're gonna be more straight on the line with that. And I think the same about drug trade, not drug trade, illegal gun trade. So for instance, back in Brazil, also especially in Rio, in order to have control of the territory, you also need to, the key thing that you need is access to guns. So who is selling that, who is buying this, it's something that we simply don't care. So I think we should set some targets and in order to focus there, and from there on, we need more, I think in general is that we need a lot of transparency on what the government is doing and what is going on in terms of the market. And responding that, and also answering the question that Don did about what's the data we would like to know. I agree with Santiago that I think we need to understand more the incentives about the young in order to go into the gangs. I think the entry and exit is not once. I think they go on and go back many times, as in any linkage with the labor market. And I think this is something very important to confirm and to have in mind, because if the problem is how to maintain it, may be that the problem is not how to make them exit from the drug gang, but also to maintain, sustain that decision, which is something different. But I think it's important to understand which markets, which business lines drives the largest margin, not only the revenue, but and this is quite difficult to get, but we need to have a clear picture about which activity is really driving profits. We have most of people in Brazil are completely sure that the main activity is drug trade. I don't think this is, depending on the city, this is not true anymore. And we should understand this better.
Thank you, Joana. Santiago?
Yes, thank you. So I agree with Joana. I think we need I mean, there's a clear case for stronger like criminal justice system and like more accountability. I will complement that with I guess maybe 2 or 3 things. One is this goes back also to the last point that Joana made and to Don's question about the data. I think the first step forward, or at least one of the first steps forward, would be to gather better data so that we understand the problem better, right? Because the key thing here is that typically like data drives policy, right? So the criminal justice system reacts to whatever is being measured, whatever like people observes, right? And so one key thing to start doing, that's I believe maybe a bit pragmatic, is to start doing surveys about not only security perceptions, but also about like more complex issues on gangs, the power that they have, the type of activities that they do. So it's clearly not an easy survey to undertake, but it's something that I believe is necessary. And let me give you just like an example. Like Andrés' successor as Secretary of Security in Medellin. So there was Secretary of Security in Medellin until I believe 2019. Then I remember I was having a meeting with his successor, and he was very concerned because of extortion in the city. He was showing me a figure saying that extortion increased by 50% from one year to the next. And then I asked him like, what's going on? And he said, look at this figure. We had 400 reports of extortion one year. And the next year, now we have 600 reports on extortion. And he was like legitimately concerned about this. This actually was in the media and like everyone was talking about that. We went to the field and did a survey and used like survey experiments to try to be precise about how to ask these difficult questions. And we asked about extortion. And our estimate is that more than 350,000 households and businesses. So 350,000 households and businesses pay a weekly extortion fee to a criminal gang. So the level of disagreement here between what the policymaker is cared about in this specific case, I'm not judging him. I mean, like, they have to do whatever they have to do, what they have at hand, right? And what is going on in reality, it's like there's an absolute mismatch. And this is from a city in Medellin where the government for the past, I believe, maybe 6 or 7 years, it does a yearly survey on citizen security. And this is an exception. In the region, most cities don't even do that. I'm not sure, maybe Joana, we've discussed about Rio de Janeiro. I think there's no citizen security survey in Rio de Janeiro. So we're only relying on crime reports that are highly underreported and where the measurement error, it's actually goes it's problematic because it's correlated with gang strength. So people is reporting fewer crimes where gangs are stronger. We only rely on crime reports in 99% of the cities in the region, and we are using that to drive policies against gangs. So I do think we need to go to the field, invest in surveys, like get this sort of data, also do more qualitative work. I think many things about how gangs work are really hard to just get with systematic quantitative data. And for instance, I'm thinking about, again, the Levitt and Venkatesh very famous paper on this Chicago gang from 1998. Something that they found is that these guys joined the gang, they're even willing to earn below minimum wage. Maybe that's true. But for instance, in Medellin, when we started to do surveys with gang members and to interview them in prison and elsewhere, something that was evident is that we started asking about how much money you make. And we started with a figure, right? And after 6 months of doing these interviews, we learned that we were not asking the right questions because this is not a regular job, right? It's not like a salary that you make. It's very unstable. There are like different sources of revenue. In many cases, the guys receive some money from the gang, but also the gang like kind of helps them and enforces some monopoly on some rent within the neighborhood. And that business is up for that person. It's something similar to what happened with the mafia in the US. So that people was like own some businesses and then they would just pay taxes up the ladder. And this in many cases happens similarly in Colombia. So it's not something that you know how much money you're making. So how do you learn about how much money these guys are making? You need to ask them and you need to be creative about how to ask this. So the additional thing there is that you actually need patience to tackle this problem. Maybe the second thing I would say about like policy moving forward is I think we need to rethink a lot of the policies that we currently have set up. And one example from Brazil that Joana might know better than me, it's the prison system. And what's the role of the prison system in actually strengthening criminal groups? So we have this Primero Comando de la Capital, PCC, a group from Sao Paulo that was born out of a massacre that the state did in a prison after following a riot in the early 90s, right? So criminal people in Sao Paulo gathered together and said, okay, we need to organize, and created this group. So for people to join the group, they need to be in the prison system. The PCC has a registry of their members, and the number of their members is the number of the inmate, the registry number when I was in prison. So the only way you're recruited, or maybe I'm generalizing too much, but more or less the only way you can be recruited by the PCC is by being in prison. And the only thing the state in Brazil is doing is putting more people in prison. So the PCC is, maybe I'm mistaken, but I believe most likely the largest criminal organization in Latin America now. And it's only going to grow if the state keeps doing the same. And something similar happens in Medellin. I mean, you see people going to prison. These prisons are highly overcrowded, most likely end up being recruited by a gang if they were not before. And we keep doing that everywhere. And the last part would be maybe the last comment I would make in terms of policy. This might be a cliche, especially for this audience, but we need to experiment more, and because we really don't know a lot. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Santiago. Andrés.
Yeah, thanks. I don't want to repeat what my fellow said before, but I think we need to keep talking about this, asking ourselves questions permanently, listening to all social sectors, trying to demoralize all questions about crime and gangs are maybe the first part of a big path we need to follow. Following Don Green's questions, by the way, it's a pleasure to have you here, Professor. I follow you, all your work. We need the data that help us to decide where it's sufficient to enforce the presence or the intervention of the state and where it's not. I think in three kind of points. One, we need to prioritize a society what is morally problematic and what is not morally problematic. As Santiago said, I don't think drugs market is as morally problematic as extortion market. Drugs have, a morally point of view that differs from country to country, but we have enough data to know that maybe marijuana, cannabis right now is not as problematic as alcohol is, So there is a necessity to ask ourselves as society, legally ask ourselves as society, what is actually morally problematic. For me, if I have to say it, extortion is the biggest problem, the biggest crime that we have to understand and that we have to combat against, organized crime, not only in Latin America, but particularly in Medellin, Colombia. As Santiago said before, I work in Medellin as Secretary of Security, and I'm pretty sure that extortion is the essence of organized crime in Medellin. Second, we need to look up for the data of the criminal markets that we determine as society are our priorities. Maybe extortion could be the first, prioritize crime that we prioritize as society. And after prioritize that kind of crimes, maybe we need to keep in mind that follow the money, pointed decision, so we keep all of our investigation in order to understand when the money is going. Because as I said before, the first question, the main objective of organized crime is money and only money. Maybe power after money, but not power by power, but power of what money could, get to all the members of the gangs. And in the third point, I want to ask to point to you. I just want to refer on one thing Joana said the first question about politicians. I think it's very, very important. We actually don't know how deeply related are criminal structures and legal states institutions in Latin America. We don't know. We don't know how deeply related they are, but my guess is they are pretty related. And when you have a very good relationship between organized crime and state institutions, it is impossible to have a very good policy to combat criminal organizations. Criminal organizations are working with the state, not in a formally level, but actually an informal level, but we don't know how deeply. Maybe knowing how deeply that conversation, that relationship is going is one of the first decisions that we have to make as society. Thank you.
Thanks, Andres. Since we only have about 5 minutes left, I would like to suggest to our 3 panelists that we take the 2 questions that are on the chat. So I can read them out loud, and then feel free to chime in as you see fit. The first question is about whether there are any kinds of sort of longitudinal studies that trace the origins of these gangs. What are the triggers behind the emergence of these gangs? Santiago was giving the one example a moment ago, and whether that can be traced over time to try to understand, how these gangs develop different kinds of strategies to legitimize themselves. If there might be variation, does one type of origin determine what happens after in terms of sort of governance strategies? And whether that might be useful to understand that path to kind of support strategies for confronting gangs. And the second question is about if we were to compare between contexts or time periods, are there differences in the design of the police that might matter in countering gangs? So for example, does having a national police under a Ministry of Defense work differently than another design?
I can jump in if you want. I'll just briefly touch on both. On the first question, I think I don't know. I don't think that we have enough information now so that we can kind of trace back the origins of all these gangs and try to leverage on the heterogeneity, on their trajectories to design policies. I think we're not there yet. But something, and here I'll speculate a bit, something that I see is like a pattern of a sort of convergence of many groups. So that in most of the cases, they start by some reason, and in most of the cases is about controlling the local drug market. For that, you need to develop coercive capacity to control the neighborhood where you are, right? Because you are regulating a market that's illegal. And after you have the coercive capacity, the marginal cost of extending your operations to other sectors is very low. So then you can extort easily. Then you can even monopolize legal markets within that neighborhood. And this is a pattern that we've seen with Joana in Rio de Janeiro, we see now in Medellin, and Mika and Carlos and others have seen in El Salvador. I think you can see like a sort of evolution that's not too divergent. There are exceptions, for instance, the PSC, that are organizations that become much, much larger, but at the very local level, it seems to be like a similar pattern. So I'm not sure whether we have like information to actually think about this. Maybe the key point is which are the incentives for these groups to constitute and to keep growing and controlling the territory that they control. And for Ayla's question about the design of the state, I do think, I'm not sure whether we have enough information to be conclusive about this, but this is something that we have discussed a lot in Colombia in particular, because in Colombia we have a national police, right? That's now underneath, like below the Ministry of Defense. I think that today there's a reason for that because of the conflict and so on. If you ask me today, I would just move the police away from the Ministry of Defense so that it becomes a bit more civilian and less as an army. But the key question, why would I not like decentralize the police too much in Colombia? It's because I believe that the local capacity of local authorities, the capacity of local authorities is not too high. And there's a high risk of corruption and like capture by the state of the police. We had a previous experience in Colombia in the 80s and 90s where there were like a sort of local police departments called the DOCs, DOC, Departamentos de Operación y Control, I believe was the translation. I believe was the name. Criminal groups just control that. And we see that in Mexico today. Like in many cities, like the municipal police department is just part of the cartel. So I think that if you ask me, my partially informed intuition would be that with a state that is not strong enough, it's better to have something centralized that it's easily to manage to some degree.
We're almost out of time, but I would like to give Joana and Andres the opportunity to chime in if you would like.
I think if I need to ask one question to the gangs would be like, which are the main economic activities that drive the most profit? Which one they start that allow them to exert the coercion, of give them resources to exert coercion, and then how they decide to diversify. And I think this is quite important for what Andres mentioned in the sense, so what is the priority? So what is the key criminal market that we need to enforce? So is extortion, is drug trade, is another one. I think, I don't know whether this answer is the same for most of the gangs, whether does it vary depending on the area and the geographic conditions of each local market. So I would ask that question first. And related to this, what are the design of the institutions that work best? I agree with Santiago, but I think it's very, very difficult to understand like the kind of like building the institutional design that allows us to have the best enforcement. I would say that it's any institution that have good accountability and good like transparency about what they are doing. But on top of that, I think we really do not understand anything that we are doing. And I want to reinforce the idea that Secretary of Securities, they need to make decisions without much information. I'm gonna give you an example. So in Brazil, we have like the penitentiary system is responsible. It's a key responsibility of the states. And we created back in starting 2006, a federal system. And there's a huge discussion whether should send like kingpins to the federal systems or not. And people have like very strong ideas about whether this is good or not. When we have never done any evaluation about that. I have never heard about it. And this is a very key important decision, whether you're gonna send kingpins all over the country. We have some like anecdotal evidence that seems that it's bad, but we are discussing the point of view, of course, for the ones who receive is not a good thing. But what happened to the places and to violence in the country, in the states where they send these criminals away, probably that has huge heterogeneity on that too, but we never even asked these questions in terms of at the federal level. So I think this is an example about what Santiago is saying, that this is an area and I would like to end with that. So public security is a key problem for Latin America in the last 30 years. And we still face and discuss this subject as amateurs. I would like just that we get 10% of the science and that we use for health and put in the public security area. If we do that 10%, we would be in a much better position than we are now. Thank you very much.
Andres, would you?
Yeah, I just want to finish my intervention answering, or maybe referring to the last two questions that are in the chat. The first thing is that I don't think the criminal problem is only a police problem. We don't know enough. We don't have enough information of what kind of policies are more efficient than others in order to work against organized crime. There is no information about that because organized crime works differently country by country. But I personally believe that organized crime is, as I said before, an institutional and a societal problem, not only a police problem. Saying that, as Catalina Bello is asking, I just want to point the thing I said before. we don't know how deeply related are politicians, law enforcement officers, state with criminal gangs. Knowing that is one of the first things we have to understand in order to actually deploy that kind of power in Latin America. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. I would like to just wrap up by saying thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to the audience for participating and for your questions. Just a reminder that this session is being recorded and that recording will be made available in the coming days. And we look forward to seeing you in future EGAP events.